Shalom Chavrim, James Trim here, and today I want to talk to you about one of many passages that Paul spoke, which has been poorly understood by many individuals, and so I want to shed some light on it and shed some light on it from the Talmud and other sources that kind of help us to understand what Paul is actually saying in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 concerning whether a person should remain uncircumcised, and also secondarily what it means about a person remaining unmarried. Before I get started here, I want to remind you all to please donate to support this work. Donations were very, very low in December, and we are trying to catch up here in January. So if you can, please donate to support these videos and blogs and all the other materials that we put out free on the internet that are paid for by donations from people like you. And there is a link in the video description where you can donate, or you can donate to donations at wnae.org via PayPal. Okay. So I want to talk about 1 Corinthians chapter 7, which is a very interesting, unusual portion of Paul's writings. And particularly, I want to address some passages that have been poorly understood by Christendom. This is a chapter that gets poorly misunderstood by Christendom, and then also poorly understood by the so-called anti-missionaries or counter-missionaries in Rabbinic Judaism. So the combination that's just a bad combination of misunderstandings. So let's explain what Paul is actually trying to say from a Jewish perspective, if you will. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 18 through 19, Paul writes, "If a man was called while circumcised, he should not return to uncircumcision. And if he was called in uncircumcision, he should not be circumcised. For circumcision is not anything, neither uncircumcision, but the observance of the commandments of the Torah." So what is this saying? Obviously, circumcision is one of the commandments of the Torah. So is this a contradiction? What's being talked about here? Well, before we go, the antinomian Christians use this passage to prove that Paul was teaching against circumcision. The anti-Paul people use it to prove that Paul was teaching against circumcision. Counter-missionaries use it to prove the same, and therefore criticize Paul. And so this passage needs to be understood. So let's first, one of the important things to understand about 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is that it is a portion in which Paul makes it very clear that some of the things that he says in this chapter are mitzvot of Elohim. And some of the things that he says are his opinion and should not be held to the standard of being from Elohim. Verse 6, he says, "But this I say to you, say as to the weak or sickly, not by commandment. Verse 10, he says, it is not from me, but from the master. So there he says, this isn't my opinion. This is from the master. Verse 12, I say, I, not the master. So then in verse 12, he turns around and says, this isn't inspired. This is just me. Then verse 17, the rule I lay down. This is almost like a minhag or whatnot, a custom that he lays down, but it's not to be counted as Torah. Verse 25, I do not have a command from the master, but I offer an opinion. And verse 40, in my opinion. So throughout this chapter, there are certain things that Paul says that are his opinion, that he makes very clear are not from Elohim. And there are other things that he makes clear are from Elohim and are not his personal opinion. He's careful to distinguish between the two. So it's very important to understand this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Very unique chapter. Nowhere else in all of Paul's letters does he go back and forth like this, saying, okay, this part's my opinion, this part's not, this part came from Elohim, this part is just me and my opinion. So amongst the personal opinions that Paul gives in this section is verses 18 and 19 about remaining uncircumcised. Now, for those amongst the Christians that say that Paul is saying that we shouldn't be circumcised, that we should not engage in the practice of circumcision today, that has been abolished because of what Paul says in verses 18 through 19. One of the problems that they have with that is that in verse 8, earlier, Paul uses very similar language to say, but I speak to those who do not have wives and to widows, that it is profitable for them to remain like me. So here Paul is saying, hey, you shouldn't get married. Should remain unmarried. Well, again, this is an opinion that he offers. And again, this is parallel to the remain uncircumcised. So if a antinomian Christian wants to argue based on verses 18 through 19 that we shouldn't get circumcised anymore, then they should also argue based on verse 8 that we shouldn't get married anymore, which is obviously, there's an old axiom of logic that an argument that proves too much proves nothing at all. So let's look at each of these and find out what it really means from a Jewish perspective. So if we turn to the book of Joshua, by the way, this has handouts. The link to the handouts, the PDF of the handouts is given in your, there's a link to the handouts in the video description, the PDF, so you can download those and print them for yourself. So we have Joshua chapter 5 verses 2 through 8 in our handout. So let's look at this, because this kind of gives us a curveball and makes us go, huh. So Joshua chapter 5 verses 2 through 8 says, at that time Yahweh said to Yahushua, make you knives of flint and circumcise again the children of Israel the second time. And Yahushua made him knives of flint and circumcised the children of Israel at Givat Ha'aralot. And this is the cause why Yahushua did circumcise all the people that came forth out of Egypt that were males. even all the men of war, died in the wilderness by the way, after they came forth out of Egypt. For all the people that came out were circumcised, but all the people that were born in the wilderness by the way, as they came forth out of Egypt, had not been circumcised. For the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness, till all the nation, even the men of war that came out of Egypt, were consumed, because they hearkened not unto the voice of Yahweh, unto whom Yahweh swore that he would not let them see the land, which Yahweh swore unto their fathers, and he would give us a land flowing with milk and honey. And he raised up their children in their stead, whom Yahushua did circumcise, for they were uncircumcised, because they had not been circumcised by the way. And it came to pass, when all the nation were circumcised, every one of them, that they abode in their place in the camp till they were whole. So this is very interesting. The commandment to circumcise was given in the Torah. It was given to Abraham in Genesis chapter 17, and it was given to Moshe and given and laid out in the Torah at Mount Sinai. So you would have thought that the people would have been practicing circumcision while they were in the wilderness. And yet Joshua chapter 5 verses 2 through 8 suddenly tells us that they didn't the whole time. For 40 years while they were in the wilderness, they were not practicing circumcision. Why? Why? So the Talmud gives us an answer. And this is found in the Babylonian Talmud, Yevamot 71b through 72a, and it's here in your handout. It says, why were they not circumcised in the wilderness? If you wish, I might say, because of the fatigue of the journey. And if you prefer, I might say, because of the north wind did not blow upon them. For it was taught in all the 40 years during which Israel was in the wilderness, the north wind did not blow upon them. What is the reason? If you wish, I might say, because they were under divine displeasure. And if you prefer, I might say, in order that the clouds of glory might not be scattered. Rabbi Papa said, hence no circumcision may be performed on a cloudy day or on a day when the south wind blows, nor may one be bled on such a day. At the present time, however, since many people are in the habit of disregarding these precautions, the Lord preserves the simple. In all the 40 years during which Israel was in the wilderness, there was not a day on which the north wind did not blow at the midnight hour. For it is said, and it came to pass at midnight, that the Lord smote all the firstborn, etc. How is the deduction arrived at? By this we were taught that an acceptable time is an essential. Okay, so what the Talmud is telling us here is that in a period of adverse circumstances, it's prohibited to do the circumcision because there might be adverse health effects, and somebody could develop an infection and die if the situation is adverse. So let's then also look at the question of remaining unmarried. Okay. There is a similar statement in the book of Jasher, chapter 5, verse 12. Before we do that, I'm going to to point out that in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul does give a reason for remaining uncircumcised. And this is found in verses 26, 29, and 31. He says, because of the urgency of the time, because the time is now shortened, and because the fashion of this world passes away. All right. So, in the book of Jasher, or Sifar HaYashar, chapter 5, verse 12, it says, and Noah refrained from taking a wife in those days to beget children, for he said, surely now Elohim will destroy the earth, wherefore shall I beget children? So, Noah basically made the determination that under the adverse circumstances, that it was not a good time for him to be getting married and having children. There's another passage in the Talmud that sheds some light on this topic, and it is a passage that I spoke about recently in another video. In Baba Batra, page 60, B, in the Babylonian Talmud, it says, it has been taught, Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha said, since the day of the destruction of the temple, we should by rights bind ourselves not to eat meat or drink wine, only we do not lay a hardship on the community unless the majority can endure it. And from the day that a government has come into power, which issues cruel decrees against us and forbids to us the observance of the Torah and the precepts, or literally the mitzvot, the commandments, and does not allow us to enter into the week of the sun. And I'm reading here from the Sonsino translation. According to another version, the salvation of the sun, we ought by rights to bind ourselves not to marry and beget children, and the seed of Abraham our father would come to an end of itself. However, let Israel go their way. It is better that they should err in ignorance than presumptuously. Now, there's something very interesting about this passage, and that is that it is one of the passages in the Talmud that offers an alternate reading. Some people ask me about the transmission of the oral Torah from generation to generation. And, is this oral transmission, how reliable is it? And they will compare it to the game of telephone or gossip, as we used to call it when I was a child, that where you'd have a circle of people, and each one would whisper something into the next person's ear, and by the time it came out all the way around the circle, it was something completely different. And one of the rules of the game was it was only whispered once. You couldn't have it repeated. That was it. All right. So if you didn't hear it well, you didn't hear it well. The oral Torah was completely different from that. The oral Torah wasn't whispered in ear one time, and if you didn't hear it right, you didn't hear it right. The oral Torah was repeated over and over and over. It was also formulatic, in phrases that were formulatic to make it easy to memorize. And it wasn't just whispered in the ear, it was memorized. And not only was it memorized, it was also lived. So in many cases, most of the oral Torah was halakha that a person would actually live out in their lives. And so it wasn't just something that you heard and tried to remember to repeat it to the next generation. It was something that you did. So there was a great checksum in transmission. However, even with that being the case, there are occasions where there were alternate versions. Now, there were also, by the way, occasions where sages, and this is mentioned in some of the rabbinic literature, would make secret copies for themselves, for their own reference, so that they would, keep their, if they didn't feel like they could remember something well. So in this case, and in other cases that you find in the Talmud, there are cases where a brisa, Tosefta, Mishnah, um, this oral material would, what a certain rabbi said or taught would maybe become corrupted. Two different versions of it would get passed down. And so the authors of the Gemara, the compilers of the Gemara, were meticulous about preserving the alternate versions, so that we would have, long before modern scholarship created critical editions, they were meticulous about recording both versions of a saying. And so here we have an example of that. So it says, according to another version, the salvation of the Son. Now, looking at the handout here, you will see that I've actually put the Hebrew here. The Talmud's written in Aramaic, but this brisa, maybe some material from the Tosefta, actually, as I recall, but this material is in Hebrew. And the phrase, the week of the Son and salvation of the Son, I have set right next to each other here, right on top of the other. Now, I say salvation of the Son because that's what the Sonsino Talmud has. But that's not actually correct, because it says the Yeshua Habain. And the Yeshua is spelled with an ayin on the end, which is not the way that we write the word salvation in Hebrew. It is the way that the proper name, the proper noun, the name Yeshua is spelled. So it's not salvation of the Son, it's Yeshua the Son. And if you look at this, you'll see that visually it is almost identical to the week of the Son in Hebrew. There's a bait in the week of the Son that's not in Yeshua, and there's a yud in Yeshua that's not in the week of the Son. Now, week of the Son doesn't really make a whole lot of sense here. Rashi interprets it to mean the week of the Son, to refer to circumcision. But circumcision is done on the 8th day, not on the 7th day. So that's a bit of a stretch. But I think the reading Yeshua the Son makes really good sense here, because if we read it with Yeshua the Son, then it says, it's been taught, Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha said, since the day of the destruction of the temple, we should by rights bind ourselves not to eat meat or drink wine, only we do not lay a hardship on the community unless the majority can endure it. And from the day that a government has come into power, which issues cruel decrees against us, this is obviously, by the way, referring to the Hadrian decree, and forbids us the observance of Torah and the commandments, and does not allow us to enter into Yeshua the Son, we ought by rights to bind ourselves not to marry and beget children, and the seed of Abraham our father would come to an end of itself. However, let Israel go their way. It is better that they should err in ignorance than presumptuously. So this appears to actually be a Nazarene brisa, or a Nazarene version of this brisa, and a Nazarene version of this saying that had survived and has come down to us. And it fits very well with what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Basically, this is saying that because the Roman government is so oppressive, we should, it's not a good time during this particular period of oppression under the Roman government, it was a not a good time to get married or to have children, and that we should, if a person could handle it, which is similar to what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, that they should abstain from getting married and having children at this particular unique time under the oppression of the Roman Empire. And this is what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is saying about circumcision, about not entering into circumcision and not entering into a marriage and having children at a time, an adverse time of oppression. That's not a good time to make these life changes when the situation is oppressive. Paul is saying, hey, this is my opinion, but it's interesting to show that there is a basis for that opinion in the Talmud, both in reference to circumcision and in reference to getting married and having children. This is very much what Paul is saying when he says, when he recommends remaining uncircumcised and remaining unmarried in verses 26, 29, and 31, because of the urgency of the time, because the time is now shortened, and because the fashion of this world passes away. It's very similar to what the book of Jasher says, that Noah's reason for remaining unmarried. It's very similar to what the Talmud says about remaining unmarried and not having children during the Great Oppression under the Romans. And it's very similar to what the Talmud has to say about the reason that people were remaining uncircumcised during the 40 years in the wilderness. So I hope this has helped you understand what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 in light of Chazal, and remember to like this video and share it with your friends, and let us know what you think in the feedback in the comment section, and subscribe to these videos, to this channel, to keep being updated as new material is produced. Until next time, may the Lord bless and keep you. May he shine his face upon you and grant you peace. Shalom.